you would sit down, I would.
Okay. Remind me what your Scottish connection was.
I grew up in Scotland.
You did.
My father was a rabbi
Mm-hmm.
in Glasgow.
So, did your mother grow up in Romania?
She grew up in,
Uh-huh.
with all the hair-raising stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, I grew up on partly told hair-raising stories.
And how did your parents meet? Where did they meet?
In Vienna.
Okay. That's one of those European stories.
It's a very European, and it seems that the Galicia...
Central European, mid-century.
Galicia-Vienna connection is very strong with many people.
Right.
A lot of people have that combination.
Right.
It's, something Germanic, but actually very not Germanic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I picked that up in those years in Berlin, that Central European.
You did, yes,
yeah. I
yes,
mean,
yes.
I obviously didn't live through it, but it's still in the air, I'd say.
Would you mind if I moved your clock?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Move whatever you like. Within reason.
It's lovely and a nice ticking ticker.
So I don't want us to start talking about anything serious until you're taping. So
Chris, I think the only one I just...
Need one back?
I like that low light. That makes me happy.
Okay.
Yeah, learn how to stop.
For women, after a certain age, it's all about lighting.
Even before that age.
Just leave it off then.
Lighting makes all the difference.
And I will just...
What about, do you have children who live here in Israel now?
3.
3, and they all live here?
They all live here. Thank God. Yes, me and Tim. Yeah.
When did you come to Israel?
69.
I'm gonna put this down here. Can you see that? Yeah, let's put it up here. Is that all right?
Is it going to be in the shot?
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
This is very different from the studio recording.
Does that feel comfortable?
Mm-hmm.
How those positions in your shot?
It's all good.
So I don't know do you remember the interview we did a few years ago?
That's what I meant.
Yes, and I remember what was so remarkable is I had never done that. So I went to divinity school. I went to Yale Divinity School. So I did
At the beginning of your career?
no,
or
in the
middle?
90s. So after I was in Germany,
Very interesting.
and then I became interested in religion. I became religious again. I became interested in religion in the world. I didn't want to be ordained. I just wanted to study theology, and so that whole study of learning to do exegesis, learning to unlock the text was just such a revelation, and it shouldn't be. I feel it shouldn't be such a revelation. I feel I wish
That's
more
your
people-
mission somewhere.
Yes,
too.
exactly. In a way, it is, and I think in Judaism there are these traditions of midrash that people get to participate in or they're aware of. In Christianity, it's just people have no idea that you can read the text with your mind and with your
with a sense of
imagination.
humor, actually.
Yes.
Yes.
So it was so fun for me to do that with you, and I remember just in the end, I put my notes to one side and opened up the Bible, and we were just walking through Exodus. So, are we taping? I don't know.
I'm rolling.
Okay.
We're rolling.
What do you think? What did you think about a text or story or a couple of stories you'd
There are
like
a
to?
number of possibilities. One possibility that I'm very fond of is the Eden story.
Okay.
Adam and Eve and God and desire and so on. Another is the flood. Actually, almost everything I've written about is important to me. So
we didn't talk about Genesis before, did we?
No.
You know what? I have notes in my purse. I forgot. There it is. Great. In fact, is there a pen?
While we're stopped, phones. If there are any phones.
Yeah, my phones are off. Can I borrow that pen, Nancy? Or do you need it? Okay. In case I need to write some notes.
what about phones? The house phones.
We'll take the risk of the house phone.
Okay.
The cell phones can, even if people are getting texts, can interact with the microphones. If the phone rings, we'll just pause.
Well, let me see. The thing about the Genesis story comes up a lot in different contexts. Do you know Ellen Davis? She's at Duke now.
Yes,
she's
I
a
know the
Christian
name.
scholar of the Hebrew
Yes,
Bible.
yes.
And she was my teacher at Yale of Hebrew Bible. Now she's at Duke. And we ended up talking a lot about Genesis and the land, the imagery of the land. We were she's gotten very interested in ecology and also helping Christians read what the text is saying about the natural world and about being creatures among other creatures. And so we talked a lot about Genesis. Do you think we should maybe do some Genesis and then there's some Noah? What do you think? And the flood, I feel, is one of these stories that's like a cartoon story for people, right? They think they know it.
Yes.
So
It's a myth in the negative sense.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. In a negative sense, it's very flat. And in fact, I mean, I loved reading what you're writing about the flood and all the layers. Can we do 2 stories in an hour, or should we just do the flood? What do you
I
think?
don't know. Depends how it goes.
Why don't we do the flood and see where that takes us? Just
Okay.
because that's different,
That
and then
appeals to
see,
you,
because
yes.
I think Genesis is so rich, and you can spend it.
Infinite number of things you can talk
Exactly.
about. Yes.
Let's just see where it goes.
Okay.
So I love the idea of taking a story again that is people learn in a religious context, but it's also very much a cultural story, right? It's an image. And you know, I know when you there's so much you wrote about. What is it? This is what here's. Let me just read this, and then let's start back at the beginning. The return to wateriness is a return to speechlessness. The drama of the generations leading up to the flood and following it becomes a drama about language, about the paradoxes inherent in the human capacity to create symbol systems. It is a drama about civilization and its discontents. So clearly you're writing about a different story than most of us have learned, whether we've learned it in Sunday school or in school. So where would you start with that story? Do you want the text or do you know it? Do you? Let me have it in front of me. You know it. Okay.
Yeah.
So where is it anyway? The floods. I just should have marked it.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6. All right. All right. So what's happening there?
What's happening there? I mean, everything is happening. I think whatever you can read in the text is happening. What I'm interested in is the issue of language and silence as a kind of autistic defensive silence. And the basis for this apparently very modern theme actually is in the Zohar, in the source of Kabbalah.
Which is the mystical
traditions, which talk about the beginnings of humankind as an experience of what's called the exile of the word.
Exile of the word.
The exile, galut hadibur in Hebrew. As if it's not just people who go through physical tribulations, but that in some way people lose their access to language and have to re-find it. And that is not simply, it's not a neurological issue. It's a psychological issue. It's a spiritual issue. So that when it comes to Noah and the flood, Noah is hemmed in his little ark, which is actually not even an ark. It's a box.
So we're talking about once the flood has arrived.
Once the flood has
All right.
arrived. Yes.
Does this loss of connection to language, does that have anything to do with the fact of the flood happening, the reason the flood?
Okay, let's go back to there. It's a good idea to start at the beginning. The flood, the word that's used for flood, mabul, is an idea of a surging mass of water, of confusion, of chaos.
It's a very resonant image right now with this tsunami in Japan. Just as you said
it's
that.
sickening. It's just.
But that surge and
yes.
that violent power
That
of
violent
water.
power that no one expects, because the waters have been confined in their normal places, and you never dream that they're going to defy those limits. And in the Zohar, behind the Zohar, there are traditions that connect that with the original creation of dry land, the original creation of a world out of the waters. And in order to achieve civilization, in the largest sense, you're going to have to emerge from the water, and from that amorphous mass of things, and achieve a human structure, human languages, ways of talking about ways of talking about experience, ways of talking about the world. And that what happens in the flood, and it actually can be traced rather closely in the language of the narrative, what happens in the flood is that there is a return to a pre-created universe, to the universe before. So it's, yes.
Without form.
Without form and void.
Right.
Which means specifically then without language.
So the void, without form and void, which is that Genesis language,
Yes,
right?
yes.
That void is a void of language.
It's a void of language.
And
And,
is
the
that-
Hebrew again is very graphic. It's tohu vavohu. And tohu vavohu, even the sound of it is like a kind of babble. A sense of, a babble of waters, and the need to control that and in some way give form to that. And that is all lost when everything is destroyed, when everything is flooded. So that would be almost like the metaphysical implication of something very physical.
And that void it is also larger than the loss of language, right? I mean, is it the loss of connection then between human beings, the loss of encounter and
Well, I
relationship?
think by language, the tradition means dibur is not technically just simply the technical act of language. It's communication, it's connection, it's everything that saves the individual and the world from a kind of autistic closure, just being closed up in oneself.
I was just thinking this is a completely different connection, but I think it works. It's in the Midrashic spirit. Conversation I had recently for the show with a philosopher from Princeton who we were talking about civility in the United States, this issue of not just how do we civil conversation and civil society, which is a problem for us right now. And he was wanting to resurrect the word conversation in, as he said, a more old-fashioned sense of not just words passing between people, but human familiarity, like shared life, association. You're actually describing something very similar.
Absolutely, I think that's very beautiful. It reminds me of Milton. Just in one of his prose essays, his polemical works actually defending marriage, describing marriage, and I think he uses the expression "it's a meet conversation," meaning it's a right kind of conversation between two people, and by that he doesn't just mean words; he means a whole life. Yes.
So the flood comes. The flood represents that breakdown of form, that form of void.
Yes. Again, what I see in it is that the flood has already happened before the flood happens. In other words, the metaphorical flood is already underway. That boundaries and forms of communication, structures of communication, have already been destroyed. In sexual life, that's one of the emphases in this kind of background of the story, that people are having sexual relations with anything and everything. And there's no sense of the kind of limiting of the forces and channeling of the forces that belongs to a civilization. And once that is gone, then the water is just a kind of realization. It's an objective correlative of what has actually happened.
And what in the background of this, or it's kind of at the origin of that, what is the nature of God? This is also reflecting God's reaction to this state of affairs among human beings.
Well, God says, "I'm going to put an end." He uses the rather terrible word "kates," which means a final end to human life. And only as a kind of afterthought, he says, "But I'll save you." So it sounds as if God is really disillusioned about the whole project.
The human project.
The project of humanity.
Right.
And it actually says, it's the most extraordinary description in the Bible itself, "Vayitatsev el libo," and he was saddened to his heart, kind of disappointed, disillusioned. Very anthropomorphic expression. We won't expect to find that of an omnipotent God.
Should we wait? Okay.
We may have to repeat that.
Okay. Oh, good. All right.
Of course, I didn't notice anything.
I was waiting for you to tell us if it was unbearable. Okay. God is disillusioned.
But that's quite a, theologically incorrect way of talking about God, as if God didn't know ahead of time what was going to happen. Basic dogma that God knows everything. But the Bible doesn't go for basic dogmas. That's what makes it such a live narrative. And God is envisioned here as someone who had great hopes, and who's disappointed of those hopes. What else can?
Well, so then we're with Noah and
Then
the
we're with
ark.
Noah.
Somehow we took it back to the beginning. You were talking about Noah being confined in his space.
That's right. Which the Hebrew word for ark again is teva, which is a box, and that sort of gives you the picture that actually he is boxed in. Very interestingly, the word teva also in later Hebrew means the word. It's the word for the word, which the Zohar will play with. The Zohar will have things to say about that. But essentially, it's a prison. It's a floating prison in which the seeds of a new civilization are preserved. And it's an extremely unnatural life that's lived in that box.
Right.
And again, the Zohar and Midrashic sources go to town on it. I mean, they really have a lot to say about that.
That's interesting, too, because we never, when that story is told, to children, for example, I think it's mostly children who hear the flood story, we never reflect on the life in the ark. You get the 2x2
yes,
coming on and then
going
coming
off
out
again.
at the end.
Yes.
So how does the Zohar, how does it play
The
with
Zohar
it?
and Midrashic sources. First of all, how did they all eat? How did the animals eat? It's a big...
Right.
Yes, I mean, all right, maybe they brought on food for the animals, but how did they get at it?
Yeah.
So the Zohar imagines very beautifully that Noah spends his whole time, morning and night, and day and night, feeding the animals. That's an expression of his desire to preserve the world. And he feeds each animal according to its own time, its own feeding schedule. So he's really rather fully occupied feeding the world. He doesn't get a wink of sleep. Again, in these midrashic sources, he has no sexual relations with his wife, and no one does. There is no sex. Even the animals on the ark, don't have relations.
Well,
with,
right,
with
it
their
would get
mates.
crowded if they added. And again, so none of this is in the text. Right?
None of it,
So
but
this
it's hinted. The hint
okay.
is, it's really a hint where God says to Noah, "You come onto the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your daughters, and her daughters." In other words, people are listed gender separate. You and your sons, not you and your wife, but you and your sons, and the women separate. And that is taken. First of all, the implication is that in a time of catastrophe, it's not proper to have a good time, to enjoy sexual relations. But I think it goes much further than that. And what you have is a necessary measure for survival, a kind of anti-flood period. It's about a year. Which really counters all the madness and the fusion of things in the waters. But then when the time comes to get off the ark, and God says, "Tsei min haTeva," leave now. He says, "Leave you and your wife." And by leave, therefore, he means not just get off, get onto the plank and walk off, but he means return to a human way of living, which means you and your wife. Dibur, speaking, the human thing. And he leaves with his sons. And again, the women separate, which means that he doesn't really agree to leave, that there is something about that setup in the box that in a strange way suits him. And what I understand from it is that Noah is fleeing. It's a defensive mechanism. He's fleeing from the hazards and risks of dibur, of talk, of the word, and of sexuality, which has proven itself to be very dangerous, to be something that's led to catastrophe. And he wants to stay in this kind of safe little module. It's like a space module, in a sense, that refuses to return to Earth, because it seems to him in some way simply safer. And that way, of course, the end really lies. because if there is no procreation, then that's the end of humanity. But what fascinates me is Noah's lack of love for life. Something is lacking in him, and it's called the lack of the word. It's called the exile of the word. One way that the Zohar points it out very vividly is that when God says to Noah, you get onto the ark with your wife and so on, and everyone else will die, Noah says not a word.
He's silent.
To God. He doesn't answer at all. He doesn't pray for the people of the world, and that occupies the very center of the narrative for the Zohar. And the Zohar thinks of that absence of intervention by...
It's true that even though Noah, in a sense, is a heroic character, because for reasons that we don't quite grasp or that are not spelled out, he's the one person who is saved.
Yes.
He's not very three-dimensional.
It's rather enigmatic, yes.
You don't see heroic qualities in him.
No, you don't. And the expression is that he found favor in the eyes of God. And that almost sounds, especially in the Hebrew, as if it's a kind of irrational preference on the part of God, that God...
And that's in the text all the way through, isn't it?
Yes, it really is.
There's also a bit
really
with
is.
David as well.
Yes.
Isn't there
yes.
this word?
The idea
Tom,
of liking.
is that a word?
The idea of liking.
Yes.
That people just like each other, and God also likes people. But for some reason, God sees possibilities in Noah that... But it's not spelled out in terms of solid, character qualities or anything like that.
But when you describe that way in which Noah is in a kind of prison, but he seems to have a comfort level with it, whether that's reflected or not, which then impedes his capacity to live fully in the world, to grow up. I mean, that is in fact an image of life, right? Of the human condition. I mean, we each have our prisons. I mean, it would be like, it's also this imagery of the difference between a victim and a survivor comes to mind, and you're kind of describing that.
Yes.
I mean, being a victim, one can get very comfortable in that.
Absolutely. And on top of that, I think precisely the things that he can't do in the ark, that he mustn't do, like sexual relations, sleeping, the way he spends all his time feeding, it occurred to me that these are descriptions of God. So there's a kind of, that God preserves, God feeds all living beings, and God doesn't sleep, he doesn't slumber nor sleep, and God, of course, has no partner.
Right.
So in a sense, there's a kind of omnipotence that Noah is experiencing in this prison, which is very, again, I think very natural, that once you have deprived yourself of life, then you see that in some way as an ideal and an expression of ultimate power, because you are not compromised now in any way by the messy world of talk, of communication, and sexuality. So there is a sense of to me, there's a sense of a defense mechanism, and he refuses to let go of it.
Right. And that's, again, a very common human image.
I think so.
How do you read a text like this, a story like this, with all of its implications and resonance, and how does it come alive for you in this place, in the year 2011? Oh, okay. What is that?
It's a car alarm.
Oh, we don't have car alarms in the States anymore.
You don't?
No,
Because they drive people
not
crazy?
really.
Go off all the
They don't go off. Do you remember when they were new? They used to go off there was always a car alarm going off.
Well,
They're not allowed anymore?
No, I think
they're
they've changed.
just
They've
less
just gotten.
sensitive, I think.
Okay. Yeah. So how does this come alive for you in a very modern life, in an Israeli life?
I tend to think and imagine on an individual basis rather than in terms of collectives, although I could see how one could easily apply this politically. But what interests me most, actually, is the life of the human being in an existential sense, and how tempting that pathology of the exile of the word is, as people, in a way become megalomaniac about how only my view is the right view, and therefore conversation in that larger sense becomes not only unnecessary but really dangerous. I mean, in the end, he becomes drunk.
Noah.
Noah becomes drunk. And so there's a kind of intoxication that comes of that kind of solipsism and depression, actually. I mean, it's a strange... I see it very much in modern psychological and psychoanalytic categories, that it's an unwillingness even to admit that one's lost something. So, and therefore one is not prepared to mourn what one has lost. So really one is caught in a state of closure that holds no hope at all. It's an impossible situation, but it's a situation that's very human.
I think this is also an example of how the Hebrew Bible preserves a picture of the messiness of human life. Mm-hmm. It's there in the holy text.
Yes.
I was having a conversation the other day with someone here in Jerusalem, and he was saying that that's become so much more and more important to him as he's moved through his life. I think it's a bit foreign for Christians. I mean, Jesus is such a perfect, but not very three-dimensional figure. I mean, there's so much that that's not known, that the text really truly doesn't address, and there's not this tradition of midrash. Mm-hmm. But even the most heroic figures, like a David or like a Noah, the one man who's saved, are flawed. These are not fairy tales with happy endings.
No. And even God himself, I mean, that's really going very far, and a traditional reading of the Bible would hesitate before going this far. But I couldn't help feeling, especially in these early stories, that God in a way is modeling to people that aspect of God which can be known by human beings, is modeling to people how not to be godlike. In other words, that God behaves in a way that is not entirely godlike, and takes the risks of that, as if to model to Noah and the other characters the possibilities of error, the possibilities of what you call messiness, and how that actually is part of the dance. It's part of the dynamic of a world that's informed by desire, which is God's world. God desires, God himself desires, he desires there should be a human being in the world. He says, let us make, in some way diminishing his omnipotence. And the Jewish tradition emphasizes that these are ways in which God connects with us, because he connects with our issues of omnipotence and of the necessity for a different approach.
I think you also talk about desire animating the reader.
Yes.
There's a desire for the text.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that we don't... I mean, reading the text half asleep is basically... is nothing.
It's not really tradition. Reading the text.
You don't read, you study. You study the text, and that implies that you don't really understand it, first off. That you read it, and then you read it again, and then you notice things, and things don't work, and things don't make sense, and then you're exercised by it. And that's what I call desire, because something that should be there is not there. And that's what gets people going. That's what gets people involved, and this very intimate connection between the human being and the text, between Jews and this text, is a result of that.
So, talk to me a little bit more about the notion of desire. It's a very evocative word. But the way you're using it has many layers that are not necessarily there in a cultural reference to desire. So take me inside that word, and I think maybe by where you pointing at how you see it come to life in the text, or in other sources.
Yes. Well, I'd have to go back to the Garden of Eden in that case.
Yeah.
And this innocent little sentence that the Lord God took Adam and placed him in the Garden of Eden, in the garden. which, when you come to think about it, doesn't make sense. Where was he before the Garden of Eden? We tend to assume loosely that that's where he was created. No, he was created somewhere else. And then God took him. So Rashi, who's the prime commentary on the biblical text.
Rashi is one of the great commentators of Midrash,
11th century, yes. And he uses Midrash a great deal. So he has this wonderful comment on the word, and God took him. And he says, the implication, what's behind it is that God, how do you take a human being? You can take an object and move it from here to there, but how do you take a human being? And he says he seduced him with words. He seduced him with beautiful words, and actually the word for seduction is used. He moved him, he lured him with beautiful words to enter the garden. That is, he couldn't take him by main force, could he? Well, of course he could. But God doesn't do that, as it were. That when it says God took, it means that he moved him to want to go. And why does God want him in the Garden of Eden? Because God has some kind of a desire that he wants to see played out in the Garden of Eden, that God desires something about human beings. And in the Midrashic literature, what God desires of human beings is simply that human beings should desire him. And that's like a delicate matter. How do you affect someone else's desire? You can't force, because that's obviously not going to work. And therefore it becomes a question of what's called seduction, in a positive sense. Seduction is something we can't live without. We're seduced by a sunset, we're seduced by a smile. Life is full of seductions. Some are more healthy than others. But you can't be without seduction in a live world, and you can't be without desire. And so God presents himself throughout the story of the Garden of Eden, I think, as someone who has desires. That he has desires, and he wants human beings to be a little less android-like, a little less robotic, and to discover the world of desire, which they don't have at the very beginning. They're just perfect. They're made just perfect. Everything fits in place.
You can't have desire unless something is lacking.
Unless something is lacking, you can't have desire. Let's just leave it at that. Unless something is lacking, and what I was going to say actually was unless you have parents. If I go with Freud, desire begins with the strange, mixed up situation, what he calls the family romance. The relation, between daughter and father and son and mother, and the need in some way to work through that and to move through and out of it to something else. They don't have parents. At least Adam doesn't have a parent. You might say, if you wanted to be very provocative, that Eve has a father, because she's born out of the body of Adam. But in any case, they don't have that very normal human experience. So they are abnormal, Adam and Eve. And so what I see is the attempt to create an unconscious desire in a situation in which the basic equipment, in a way, is missing, because what God really wants is the next generation. The next generation will have parents and will already be born into what you call the messy, the messy world. And there's something about that God wants, that God loves, because it produces desire.
So what's interesting to me there, I remember when I first started knowing how to get inside these texts, I was fascinated by the notion of delight in the Garden of Eden, that Eden means delight.
Yes.
It's all over the place, actually, once you start. Again, I don't think a word people associate with the Bible. So God has created this delightful place. The food is delicious, right? Everything is beautiful.
Yes.
And as you say, perfectly suited to their needs.
Yes.
And then there's an irony there, isn't there? That because it's all perfect and beautiful and delicious, they don't know desire. Which then it turns out that they can't be complete without that.
Yes, and then of course in the difficult way that things always happen, their first real meeting with desire is through the snake, through the serpent, who comes with his evil seduction, with his disturbing seduction, and they're not equipped to know how to deal with it. Eve is not equipped at first, and so she allows herself to be seduced by the serpent, and then she seduces her husband. She seduces Adam. So it's a whole, suddenly there it is. It's a world that's full of unruly impulses, and the aims. What I see as a wonderful turning point is when Adam lies to defend himself. When God asks him, "Where are you?" and when he's hiding in the garden, and he answers, and God asks him, "Don't you know the time?" And Adam answers, "The woman that you gave me."
He blames.
Yes, she gave me of the fruit, and I ate. And that's when we're really embarrassed. That's because we identify somewhere now. I recognize this. This is human. Human in an embarrassing way. We don't want to acknowledge that is who we are. And what I suggested, and what seems to me very plausible, is that it's not exactly a lie. He is saying the truth. His wife did give him of the fruit, and he did eat. He's ignoring many things. But I think what he's doing, actually, is saying two things at the same time. Yeah, that on the one hand, he's in a way confessing that that's the truth. This is what happened. And at the same time, he is trying to justify himself. He's trying to pass the buck to Eve. And that, I think, is the moment of humanity. That's when we really start talking. I think
about who we are and what we're like.
About who we are, yes. Alex Brodsky said, human consciousness begins with one's first lie. Because that's when we begin to be aware of the complexity in ourselves and the different impulses. And that's where poetry comes from as well. Not only bad things come from saying two things at the same time. As long as you have a kind of straight, unequivocal, immaculate version of things, then there can be no poetry and there can be no tension, no desire. Again, the desire makes itself felt when language comes alive.
How do you think about the meaning of knowledge, right? It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Let me just say something that I was struck by, and as I learned to read this, but I want you to open it up and take it in another direction, if you will, that for one thing, I think to a Western mind that there should be something wrong with knowledge, that God should forbid knowledge, is offensive and strange. Strange for the faithful and the problem with religion for the unbeliever. But the knowledge that Adam and Eve gain is petty. I mean, it's not evil. It's not catastrophic. It's evil. It's like they know that they're naked, whereas before they were very happy. And they know how to lie and they know how to blame. What is that word, the knowledge? What is the image in the Hebrew that...
Well, when sexuality begins properly between Adam and Eve, the word that's used is vayeda Adam, that Adam knew his wife.
Right.
Knew
right.
Eve. So...
And is that the same word as the tree of knowledge?
It's the same
really?
word. So I can't help thinking it's not theoretical knowledge that we're talking about here. We're talking about consciousness in its fullest sense, and intimacy. And again, it has to do with communication and language. And God wants it, actually.
The knowledge.
Actually, he wants the
consciousness.
He wants that to happen. There might have been better ways for it to happen, but it happens in this way. And perhaps in the end, it's not so clear that God wasn't opening the sluice gates in a way to all that. Because without that, God drives Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden after that. And it seems almost as if a new period has to begin now, in which the bliss, what you call the total pleasure, the French have this lovely word, jouissance, which I think of for Eden, for Eden.
Yes.
that total bliss has to be, in a way, moved out of. There is a kind of divorce from that kind of relationship with God, that kind of relationship between man and woman, and into something more
and
complicated.
even that relationship with the natural world,
With the natural
which is
world,
very
with the
evident these
natural world.
days. When we
Yes, yes. And there is an ideal somewhere in Jewish thinking of ultimate return to the Garden of Eden. But clearly it's not a return to the same way it was, because once you've been through experience, you return to innocence in a very different way. And yes, so I think knowledge really has a lot to do again with desire. And in fact, one of the great commentators, Nachmanides, translates the word as desire.
The word knowledge?
The word knowledge here, the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he understands as the tree of desire for both good and evil. That is, the capacity to love and to hate, he says. That before there was no loving and no hating, because it was just, everything was in a way unequivocal.
Let's change the tapes, and we'll just keep going about 15 more minutes, if that's all right. Is that okay? All right.
Cough, cough, cough.
Cough now, Kate.
It's like an Israeli concert hall.
We're between movements of Beethoven.
This is so wonderful. Where is it? Oh, there it is. I wanted to ask you about this.
What were you looking for?
I'll tell you in a minute. I want to ask you about it.
We're rolling again.
Okay. So it seems to me that what you're describing kind of harkens back to this larger theme of almost a maturation process of God's relationship, or God's desire for what human beings might be, the relationship, how God might build that relationship. I mean, I don't even know how to say it. So I was thinking, after we were talking about Noah a minute ago, just as I was turning the pages and we moved to Genesis, I saw, as you said, there was this moment where God, in this Everett Fox translation, which tries to stick closer to the Hebrew, he says, and God was sorry he had made them.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's almost like what you're describing is a learning process on the part of both God and humanity.
Yes. I have to confess that I have a little reservation about that kind of language about God. It doesn't come smoothly to me.
The which language?
The language of God learning.
Okay.
God learning. And the way in which I've come to think about it, I know this is the way people do talk now, that God learns, especially in the flood story, and he changes his mind and he realizes no more floods and so on. The way in which I've come to terms with it is to think of God as a character in the story who obviously cannot be perfect. As a character in the story, he can't be omniscient and omnipotent. And the way the story is told, in fact, makes that clear. The God who, according to Jewish tradition, has written the story is like the author vis-a-vis the character. And the God who transcendentally is at the back of the God who writes the Bible is yet again another stage further away from projections of various kinds. But the God in the story itself, God has written a story about himself as a character, and that character, yes, learns. He learns because he wants to teach human beings to learn. Somewhere there's a kind of modeling there which may be very far from, an official education agenda. It's not necessarily an educational project. It's just something you can't help picking up as you're reading.
It's more of a creative process.
It's a creative process, yes.
So when I was first thinking about theology, I was also writing fiction and reading people writing fiction, and
yes,
there are all those. We use so many metaphors to think about God, and the one that's most, readily at hand is God as Father. But I've thought about God as author, but so people who write creatively often describe how their characters, if the story comes to life, they lose control, even
Yes.
though they are the writer.
Yes.
And so, what you're describing in a way is, as a way to think about this in our time and space, is an author who's also then has a capacity to enter the story and be both of those things, but then in entering the story loses control. Is that?
I think loses control as, in the same way as a human, as you say, as a human writer loses control. It's not exactly losing control.
No.
It's actually discovering forces that were not explicit before, that were not fully, and suddenly they find these forces and these ways of creating things suddenly become real. And so in that sense, it's losing control in terms of a neat, as we say, an unmessy package.
And losing control in the sense of having to interact
Yes.
then with the other,
Yes.
the three-dimensionality.
Again, the idea of language. Yes, that once words are used, then they are inevitably human words. And God has to use human words. However divine the words are, they're clearly a restriction on his infinite power. And it's a blessed restriction in some ways, because it makes a world possible, a human world possible.
What else comes to mind as you think about this?
Something did come to mind, but it floated off.
You often bring literature, not religious literature,
Yes.
just literature into your midrash in a way, I think. Is that fair to say it that way? Something, if it comes back to you, just to say. I think something very moving for me when I finally read the Genesis story closely was this idea, where is it? This image of, God planted a garden in Eden / land of pleasure, which is however Fox has translated it. This idea that, I can't find it, it's repeated a couple of times, I think, of Adam and Eve living in this land of pleasure, meeting God in the cool of the day. There's this proximity. And then there's an echo of that, which is sad or nostalgic in a way, after they are expelled from the garden. And God has done this, right? There's just this one line, it's verse 21, chapter 3. Now Yahweh God made Adam and his wife coats of skins and clothed them. Which, as you said before, they didn't have parents, which means they couldn't be fully human. But this is a very paternal gesture.
Yes.
And they've been punished.
Yes.
And then they are clothed.
Very tender gesture.
Yes.
Yes. It's, in fact, it's typical, again, of, in this case, I think it's a Talmudic source that says, from here we learn that we should clothe the naked. In other words, we learn from God's actual behavior, which in a way is kind of ungodlike, that God should be involved in such physical things as actually clothing people. But the whole tenor of the language is about human life, and God has to find his place. What came to mind again when I thought about that was the beautiful expression that's used about God, that he looks for a dwelling place in the lower worlds. And that's why he commands the building of the tabernacle later on. That is, in some sense, God dwells in this world. And it seemed to me that the human language that God is obliged to use,
almost captive
is actually, that's the house he lives in. That's the dwelling place of God, that he's willing to accept a kind of lower dwelling place, a place that doesn't really suit his grandeur, because of what can happen, once the lower worlds are acknowledged to have God in them.
And so you're not just thinking about our texts, but the texts included. I mean, that's the text included,
I see.
the written
Yes,
text,
yes.
the sacred text
The sacred
included.
text, yes, that, but not that only, yes. Yes.
I mean, that's an interesting way to think about how powerful this kind of text is,
Mhm.
and yet flawed. I mean, not enough.
Yeah.
Not enough.
Not enough. It needs reading. Needs reading and reading, because I mean, well, in a way that maybe it's perfection, but it's a perfection that goes via apparent imperfections, and the energy that's created then of the reading process is much more important than having a perfect text, whatever that might be, which I think is actually an impossibility. I don't know what a perfect text would be.
But I also mean, you might think in the abstract that if human beings are encountering the Word of God, that would be enough to, right, to live by, to live, to get it right. And I think that again, for outsiders to our traditions, would point at the fact that there's supposedly the Word of God, and there's so much, but then humanity is humanity. But what you're describing, I mean, of course, it doesn't suffice.
There's no fail-safe. There's no, password to the good life in a text. It's all alchemy. It's all how we incorporate the text, what we do with it.
And again, that word, that language is life. It's not just words, not just speech.
Well, I think speech is involved very much in it. But yes, I mean, the Torah is life. It's a plain statement, that is made. The psalmist makes it in different ways. And it's life in its most immediate. People who are imbued with the text, with the biblical text, it's always in their minds, in some sense or other. That is, that things are always floating up, words are always floating up, and completing things and opening things up, and so you sometimes see. This is one of my memories of my father. On Jerusalem bus, sort of getting onto the bus and sitting next to some other bearded character, and the two of them just beginning to have this cryptic conversation in which, it'd be one quote and another quote, and, kind of barely opening their mouths, just communicating sort of underground. No one else could have told what they were talking about, but they're talking at a depth.
The title of your most recent book, The Murmuring Deep, so evocative. Does that point at that depth you're talking about? Or just describe what you mean by that phrase.
I suppose by the murmuring deep, I mean the living and rather disturbing being of the universe, what was called the deep, the Tehom, at the beginning of Genesis. That the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep. The idea that might not have been a silent deep, but actually there might have been a murmur or a moan or something coming up from there, which in a way had to be interrupted in order for there to be speech. That light had to come into the darkness, and speech had to come and disturb that very disturbing sound, which is a kind of sound of basic life, which is always there, nevertheless, as far as I can understand it. Underneath all the words we say, what we are really communicating with on some primal level, kind of elemental level, is, I suppose you could say, the unconscious, or things that cannot be put into words, which are also part of communication. It's also part of what we convey to one another.
Right, you say the biblical unconscious. It's the reflections on the biblical unconscious, and what you're kind of describing is that biblical unconscious meeting the human unconscious, and the strange and essential things that happen in that.
Yes,
in that meeting.
and that's really the joy of reading. I think that we are not solving riddles when we read the Bible, but we're responding with everything that's in us, and we trust that there is enough there to meet that.
What else? Anything you want to say as we finish, anything that's come to you that you want to bring in, any image or story or...
I don't know if anything comes immediately to mind, or too much comes to mind. Maybe that's another way of putting it. I think what we're doing now is an example of what we're talking about. That there are all kinds of desires at work in this kind of conversation, and that adds a richness to what officially is going on. Sort of guesswork, like what are you really saying? What am I really saying?
Right.
And so on. And as precise as we try to be, we never quite say it, and that's what makes it interesting. That's what makes it exciting.
It's that dialectic between strangeness and familiarity that you also describe.
Yes. And without the strangeness, it would be a very dull affair. It wouldn't really give birth to much.
All right. Avivah Zornberg, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. Are you happy? Okay. Trent is... Actually, everybody on our team is completely besotted with you and with that program we did before. And I was kind of nervous coming in here because I felt like I couldn't rise to that occasion.
Well, you certainly did. I really enjoyed this very much. Yes.